Ma tavu alecha Yaakov mishkanotecha Yisrael. Famous pasuk of Bilam. He describes he looked at Klal Yisrael and what did he see? What amazing thing did he see? He saw, according to the Midrash, the HaKenesset of Midrashot, which is the Makom Shechina. Really, he wanted to daven to Hashem that give a klala that the Shechina should be removed, but he was moved to say the exact opposite and praised HaKenesset as the Makom Shechina and the secret success of Klal Yisrael. The idea of a Beit Knesset being a Makom of Shechina, it comes up over and over again. In Brachas, the Gemara in Brachas talks about the importance of davening dafka in a shul or in a Beit Midrash because it's a Makom Shechina and the Shechina is always matsui there. Elsewhere, the Gemara in Megillah describes a shul as a mikdash ma'at, a mini Beit HaMikdash. In other words, since the Chorban Beit HaMikdash, we don't have a Beit HaMikdash, but we still have, based on Pesukim in Yechezkel, we still have this mini version of the Beit HaMikdash with our shul. What I'm trying to understand is the nature of the kedusha of a shul. Now, the idea that the shul itself, the building of the shul, has some sort of kedusha. L'chor is an explicit Mishnah in Megillah. The Mishnah states in Kaf Ches, Mishnah in Kaf Hey, sorry, Bnei Ha'ir shemachru rechova shel ha'ir, they sell the town square, so lochim b'damav Beit HaKenesset. They can use that money to buy Beit HaKenesset, but if they sold the Beit HaKenesset, they have to buy a Aron HaKodesh. Lochim teiva, mochrim teiva the Aron HaKodesh, lochim mitzpachot. They can buy the mantle for the actual Sefer Torah, mitzpachot yikhu svarim l'khu Torah. Each time they have to buy something more kadosh. Rashi explains shemalim b'kodesh v'lo maridin. In other words, the Beit HaKnesset really has kedusha. It's not the same level of kedusha as the Aron Kodesh or the mitpachot of the Sfarim, but still it has kedusha, and that kedusha has to be respected. And if a Beit HaKnesset is sold, so the money that's acquired through the sale has to be used for something which is even more kadosh. So what exactly is the nature of the kedusha of the shul? So the Ramban there in Megillah says what we're dealing with is two types of kedusha. There's what's called tashmishei mitzvah and tashmishei kedusha. Tashmishei kedusha are things which are associated with items of real kedusha, items of Shem Hashem, of Torah, and like tefillin or anything, tefillin case, anything that's used directly for something which has true kedusha. There's another category called tashmishei mitzvah. Tashmei mitzvah means anything that's used for a mitzvah, like a lulav or tzitzit, but it doesn't necessarily have an association with Shem Hashem. The basic distinction in the halacha between the two categories is tashmishei kedusha, even after a person finishes using them, and let's say the tefillin have worn out, or you want to buy a new case, the case retains its kedusha, and you can't just throw it out. Whereas tashmishei mitzvah means something which you use for a mitzvah, like a lulav or tzitzis, mikradim, when you finished the mitzvah of lulav. So it can be thrown away. You shouldn't do it in a disparaging way, but it doesn't retain any kedusha after the mitzvah is finished. While you're doing the mitzvah, you have to show kavod to the item. But once the mitzvah is finished, okay, you just mustn't be disparaging and disrespectful towards it. Says the Ramban, the kedusha we're discussing here in talking about the Beit HaKenesset is the kedusha of tashmishei mitzvah, which means since the shul is used for the mitzvah of davening to Hashem, so the shul is an object used to do a mitzvah, therefore you have to show a certain amount of kavod to the shul. But once it's sold, okay, so the kedusha goes, once you've finished using it, and it's no longer used to daven, so it no longer has significance, and there's no problem selling it. And says the Ramban, fundamentally, even the money you get from that sale has no real dinim, but out of respect for the shul, you shouldn't use it with anything which is less kavodic. But fundamentally, as soon as you finish using the shul, its kedusha goes, because its kedusha was only by virtue of the fact he was using it for a mitzvah. There are other makorot which seem to suggest there's a far more fundamental and strong significance to the kedusha of a shul. The Rambam in Sefer HaMitzvahs is discussing the issa of lo tasu kein l'Hashem Elokecha, which is an issa to, just like the Torah says you should destroy the mizbachot and the matzevot of Avodah Zarah, and you shouldn't do similarly to Hashem, which is understood as a prohibition of destroying items of kedusha and destroying Shem Hashem. When the Rambam brings it in the Sefer HaMitzvot, he includes obviously the issa to destroy Beit HaMikdash, but he adds שלא לאבד בית המקדש, או בתי כנסיות ובתי מדרשות. וכן אין מוחקים שמות המוקדשים. He sticks in the middle that not only is there an issue to destroy the Beit HaMikdash, which is definitely kadosh, and there's issue to erase Shem Hashem, which is definitely kadosh, but midoraita, the mitzvah includes not destroying a Beit HaKenesset. In other words, Beit HaKenesset has a kedusha min ha-Torah, and it is similar somehow to a Beit HaMikdash. There's a makom which is miyuchad for Hashem. Similarly, there's a Yereim. The Yereim goes even further. The Yereim in the mitzvah of Mora Mikdash says the Mora Mikdash, to have fear from the Makom HaMikdash, feel awe from the Makom HaMikdash, doesn't just include the Beit HaMikdash itself, but he adds, V'yereitem Elokecha tziva b'kanes adam leMikdash, or b'Beit HaKenesset, or b'Beit HaMidrash, yinhag behem Mora v'kavod. In other words, min HaTorah, there's a mitzvah of Mora Mikdash also in the Beit HaKenesset, which basically once again puts the Beit HaKenesset on a parallel together with the Beit HaMikdash as a building which itself has significance, and the person has to feel awe inside. The Yereim even goes further and says, Kashem shasur lehanot min ha'hekdesh, kach asur lehanot min bati kinesiot min midrashot, shnit yachdu letfila ledrasha shegam zeh hekdesh. So there's actually a kedusha in the building where it's prohibited to benefit from the building for a mundane purpose, because the building itself is designated for service of Hashem. So all these makorot really push this idea that not only is a shul simply a place where we do the mitzvah of davening, but the building itself has been dedicated to Hashem, and therefore the building itself has significance. The person entering the building has to feel a positive sense of awe and trepidation that he's entering a house dedicated to Hashem. Halacha, this is all brought down. If you look in the Shulchan Aruch, the description of how a person should act within a shul is very light. Right? The person shouldn't be outwardly disrespectful, shouldn't have kalot rosh, shouldn't joke around and sicha betela, shouldn't eat and drink. But it's limited to that. Lists of things which you shouldn't do, things which disrespect the place. Compared to that, the Kaye Adam, when he describes how a person should act in a shul, he explicitly quotes the Yereim and talks katva poskin the mitzvah liyeramina mikdash noeg bebeit HaKenesset beit HaMidrash midoraita. A person has to actually feel awe and trepidation as they walk into a Beit HaKenesset. Could be that this is really a machloket, possibly between the Gemara and the Tosefta. There's a Tosefta that describes how a person should act in a shul, and it brings this idea of kalot rosh. It says Beit HaKenesset en negoy mehem kalot rosh. Lo yikenes ben b'chama b'nei achama b'tzina b'nei atzina. You shouldn't go in just to have shade from the heat or the cold. Ein ochlin ve'ein shotim. Shouldn't eat and drink there. Ve'ein yeshenin behen. And you shouldn't sleep there. And mein metailin notin. You shouldn't just hang around in the shul for no reason. One of the many things listed in this list was ein yeshenim. Now, not sleeping there, not falling asleep there, is different to all the other activities. All the activities are active things which are a certain type of kalot rosh. Not sleeping, it's not an active zilzal of the place, but it certainly shows a lack of awe of the significance of the place. What's fascinating, when the Gemara in Megillah Kafchet quotes this Tosefta, the line of Ein Yeshenim Behem disappears. When the Gemara quotes Tosefta, everything else appears. You can't have kalot rosh, you can't joke around, you can't eat and drink, but there's no prohibition or mention of the issur of sleeping. And again, that comes down to the Shulchan Aruch, where it also talks about not having kalot rosh, but leaves out the prohibition of sleeping. The Gemara in Bava Batra that tells a story that there was a shul in Matamachsia, in the town of Rabashi, that fell into somewhat of disrepair, and they need to rebuild it. So Rav Ashi decided, how I'm going to convince everybody they have to take note of this shul and rebuild it. So he actually moved his bed into the shul and went to sleep every night in the shul. And people are like, oi, our big Talmid Chacham, our tzaddik, is sleeping in the shul. We better do something about it and rebuild it. So it seems from there that it's okay to sleep in a shul. Tosot there immediately asks, it's written in the Tosefta, you're not allowed to sleep. The answer, Tosot comes up, the answer is, you're right. It's asa to sleep in a shul, even a shul which has fallen into a state of disrepair because it's a makom kadosh. It must be Rav Ashi was sleeping in the ante-room, slightly outside of the main ulam, and that's why it was okay for him to sleep there. Again, you see this tension of, is sleeping in a shul, which is a lack of awe, but not necessarily an active kalot rosh, a problem. Really what we're getting then is these two models. Either a shul is, okay, it's nothing significant to the building itself, it's just a makom where we daven, or a shul, the actual building, the actual place has significance because it's a place dedicated to Hashem, to daven to Him there. Take this a little bit further. There's a Gemara in Brachas Samach Bet, which talks about three different prohibitions. It talks about taking a shortcut through a shul. It talks about wearing shoes in a shul, and it talks about spitting in a shul. Now, these three prohibitions clearly exist in the Beit HaMikdash. A person is not allowed to take a shortcut through the Beit HaMikdash. He's not allowed to wear shoes when he's around the Beit HaMikdash, and he certainly can't spit. But when it comes to a shul, there's a clear distinction. The Gemara says straight out, a person is not allowed to take a shortcut through a shul, but he is allowed to wear shoes. And then the Gemara starts discussing, what about spitting? Right? It used to be very normal. A person would spit, would have a rock, and he would spit on the floor. It wasn't considered absolutely disgusting, like it is today. Is spitting like shoes, which is permitted in a shul, or is spitting like taking a shortcut, which is prohibited? So the Gemara prevents two different opinions. Amar Rava says, "Rekika Beit HaKenesset Sharia Midi Dahava Aminal." Spitting in a shul is permitted just like wearing shoes, and but the Gemara raises maybe that's not true. Maybe you should say it's asur because it's just like taking a shortcut. In solution, in the conclusion of the Gemara says the following almost enigmatic statement: Amar Ela Amar Rava, Ki Beito. A shul is like a person's home. Ma Beito kapandaria kapidinish. Arekiko minal lo kapidinish. Af Beit HaKenesset akapandaria hu da'asur v'rekiko minal shari. Gemara says a shul is like a person's home. When a person will be makpid for a guest to do in his home, so that's what you can't do in a shul. What does that include? A shortcut, and there would also be, but that's it. A person isn't makpid if a person wears shoes in their house, and therefore it's permitted to wear shoes in a shul, and a person is permitted to, would not be makpid on a person spitting on the floor in their house. I guess in those days when they had, earth floors, so to a person wouldn't be makpid on spitting in their house, and therefore it's permitted in the Beit HaKenesset. Why is this Gemara so significant? So the Rav has a vort on this Gemara that says, what do you see from the Gemara here? That what is a shul? A shul, we could have thought of a shul as God's house, a place dedicated to Hashem. It's His home, and when we come to a shul, we're entering into His world, into His Beis HaMikdash. Very similar to the Gemara in Megillah that describes a shul as a mikdash ma'at. If that's true, then the rule should be very similar to the Beit HaMikdash. But the Gemara in the concluding line here says, no, a shul isn't God's house, which we come and visit. Rather, it's like a person's house. And therefore, the rules that apply to the kavod of a shul are similar to rules a person would expect within his own home. And really, it's our house where we daven, and Hashem, as it were, is a visitor. Hashem comes and visits the Beit HaKenesset because it's the place where we decided to sit down and to stand in front of Him and daven to Him. But essentially, it's our house which God visits. Two totally, fundamentally different views of the shul. God's house, dedicated to Him, a mini Beis HaMikdash, or really our home, which Hashem visits, and this place where we dedicated this should be our home, in which we daven to Hashem. Again, even when it comes to spitting, the simple conclusion of the Gemara sounds like spitting should be permitted. The Rabbi in the Gemara says, what do you mean? It can't be that spitting is outright permitted. Why? It must be only spitting permitted where you immediately get rid of the spit and you sort of rub it into the ground. It's only permitted b'shivshav mipnei. Why? Shebeit HaKenesset mikdash ma'at. B'sarich l'nhod bo kavod lifnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The Rabbi says, no, I'm convinced that Beit HaKenesset is like a mikdash ma'at, and therefore you can't do rikika. You have these two different views. I'll finish off with an amazing ha'ara I once heard from Tanon Brooks when I was in yeshiva, that we have a minhag when we walk into a shul to say two pesukim. It's based on a Siddur Rashi. There are two pesukim we say. The first is Ani rob chastecha vo beitecha shtecha b'alhecha kodshecha biratecha, and the second is Matavu alecha Yaakov mishchatech Yisrael. Just pay attention to the content of those two pesukim. The first, why do we say it when we walk into a shul? We're describing, we're declaring as we walk into shul, I'm walking into God's house. It's describing walking into God's house, walking to Beis HaMikdash, and we use that pasuk as we walk into shul. But then the second pasuk we say is Matavu alecha Yaakov. Bilam understood, apparently, that Beit HaKenesset are O'alecha Yaakov, the Olim of Yaakov. They really are homes. And what we're doing when we're walking to shul is walking to our house, which we've set aside to be able to daven to Hashem. So already from the first moment we walk into the shul, we're already hit with this chakira, with this sveidinim, whether a shul is really more like a mikdash ma'at, or it's really our home, which we've dedicated to Hashem.